back for another Feature Friday. I'm your host, Ryan Glover, and this week we're going to be talking about building an infinite input. So, an infinite input is one of those UIs where you have a row, it's like a table row with inputs in it, and then you have a button beneath that where you can say add another, and then you can just infinitely add rows. And this is super useful for products that are doing anything with data entry. So, if you're building like a sort of pseudo spreadsheet type of interface, you're going to want to know how to do this. Or if you're building something like a hosting platform where you need to do entry of configuration data or settings. So if you think about something like Heroku, if you need to do environment variables for the application that you're trying to deploy, you need an infinite possible number of those inputs. So you'll have your inputs, and then you'll be able to click a button and just say add another environment variable, add another one until you're done. So in this week's video, we're going to learn how to build that using React. Alrighty folks, before we dig in today, I do want to remind you to check out pup at cleverbeagle.com/pup. This is the boilerplate that we use for all of our tutorials here on Feature Friday, and it's also the boilerplate that we use with all of our mentorship customers at Clever Beagle. So even though it's primarily built for our mentorship customers, it is open source and it's MIT licensed, so you're free to clone it and tweak it and do whatever you want. And if you're interested in seeing what we're up to or getting new release information, hop over to the site and pop in your email in the input down here, and we'll send you updates as soon as they're available. So to get started for this tutorial, what we're going to do is utilize the index page or the index component in pup. So if I hop over to my text editor here, I'm going to go to Imports, UI, Pages, and then Index. I'm going to open this index.js file. And this is what we're seeing over here in the browser. So this is just a placeholder page for pup when you first download it, but we can swap this out with our dynamic input interface here. So the very first thing that we're going to do is get rid of this, and from time to time when I'm working on a new UI, I'll just write some kind of nonsense HTML just to get the idea out of my head. So in this case, what I'm trying to work towards is having a table of inputs, and I think what we should do is use the example that I talked about in the introduction to this video. So we talked about having like a list of environment variables for a hosting platform. So those typically have a key name and a value. So the key is what is the environment variable name, and then the value is what are the contents of that environment variable. So I think that's going to be the right way to go here. So why don't we start by just mocking this out. So what I'm talking about is saying something like, we'll do a table component, and if you've never watched Feature Friday before, or you've never worked with pup, this table component, I know where this is coming from. So this is coming from the React Bootstrap package, and this is the package that we use to get the Bootstrap CSS frameworks components in React components. So by default, they're just HTML patterns. They don't really have a component library that they ship Bootstrap for. So React Bootstrap gives us the React components component that's missing in Bootstrap. So I know where table's coming from, and we'll import that in a little bit. We'll pull that in up top. So the first thing we're going to do is say table, and then I'm going to say, I know there's going to be a head on this table. It's going to be a row, and it's going to have a key as one column title and a value as another. And then what we're going to do is jump down beneath that, and we're going to say tBody, trow, and we know that we're going to have a table cell, or table data. I don't really know why they call it TD. It should be like TC or something like that. But what we're going to do is put input type equals text, and we're going to say name equals, in this case we'll call it env key. I don't really like that, but that's a good way to mentally separate it for us while we're working here. So we'll say env key, and I'm going to say class name equals form control. And this class name is coming from the Bootstrap CSS framework. So that's another one of those things I just have memorized. So what that's going to do is it's going to apply Bootstrap styles to a text input, and a regular HTML text input, but it's going to make it look a little bit nicer than what you'd get from the browser by default. So what I'm going to do is duplicate this, And we're going to add another one here. We're going to call this, instead of env key, we're going to call it env value. And we're going to keep form control on there. So what we're trying to do here is get two inputs side by side in a table. So I'm going to say the placeholder text on this one is a key name. So we'll say env_var. So this all uppercase underscore uppercase structure, that's very common for environment variables when you're dealing with a hosting platform. So we're going to do that to kind of give our users a hint and say, hey, this is kind of what you should type in here. And then we'll just say variable value goes here. And that's good enough hint. So at this point, why don't we go ahead and save this? And yeah, actually before we do, we got to pull in this table component. So I'm going to jump up to the top here. And it looks like this file was already using React Bootstrap as a dependency. So I'm going to add table. And we're going to go ahead and save this. And you know what? I'm also going to get rid of this styled component. So in pup, we like to use the styled components library. And this styled index is no longer necessary for us. So we're going to drop that. And we're also going to get rid of, oh, you know what? I'm going to keep styled around because I bet we will use it at some point here. So we're just going to leave that as is. If we jump back over, we can see, there we go, our UI is starting to take shape. So we've got the env_var, the key on the left, and then we've got the value on the right. And so this is part of the way. So what I'm going to do is spice up this table just a little bit, just to give it some separation here. And I think what I'm going to do, oh yeah, let's say bordered, and then that should give us a nice border around both of these inputs. So basically it'll give a border around the table. There we go. That looks a little bit better. And then I'm also realizing that we're missing something. So ideally when you're building an interface like this, you need to give your users a way to go back or undo whatever it is that they're doing. So in this case we have this empty key and empty value, but there's no way to get rid of this, which could be a little bit confusing for somebody who's never done this before or never seen an interface that looks like this. So what we're going to do is add a third column here. And what I'm going to do is, typically if a column in a table isn't going to have a title associated with it, what I'll do is I'll just put an empty header in, and then I'll just have whatever the action is there. So in this case, I'm going to say TD, and then we're going to put in a button. And I'm going to use the danger class name from Bootstrap. So BS style, this is coming from React Bootstrap. That's what they refer to the prop name in the library to say apply this Bootstrap style to this component. So for the button, I'm going to say danger, and that'll give it a nice red color with white text, just so our users know, like, okay, this is very dangerous, don't do this. So we're going to say, go ahead and add the button, and I'm just going to say delete. We'll make it very clear what this is going to do. And if we go ahead and save that, we should be getting pretty far here. So one thing that I'm noticing is that our index component is a functional component. So I almost said stateless functional component there, but one of the React team members posted something on Twitter not too long ago, Dan Abramov, I believe it was, and he mentioned that the best name for these sorts of React components is just a functional component or a function component. And the reason for that is that he made a good point, which was technically if we were doing a class component, which is what we're going to convert this to, and you know what, let me actually just go ahead and start working through this. So technically a class component can be stateless. It doesn't have to have React state. And so the name stateless functional component for what we've got down here isn't really true to the nature of what it is. And so again, we want to call these function components or functional components, but something that gets rid of that stateless word so we know what we're dealing with. All right, so what we're going to do is take this and we're going to move it. So let's get rid of this. Unfortunately, we haven't written any props or anything yet, so we don't have to stress about migrating all that. So I'm going to say add a render function here. And from that, we're going to return all that markup. So we should be getting the exact same result. And if you're curious, right now my linter is yelling at me. It's saying component should be written as a pure function. So there's another name for it, as a pure function. And that's what we just converted from. And it's saying that because I haven't added any state and I haven't added any lifecycle methods to this component yet. So if neither of those exist, your linter is going to say, hey, wait a minute, you should probably simplify this. You don't need all this firepower for your component. And so what we're going to do is get around that by saying state equals. So I'm going to add state as a class property here. And I've put a little link up on the screen for you about what a state property, or excuse me, a class property is. So check that out if you've never seen this kind of syntax before. You may have seen something like this, the constructor syntax for defining state. Nothing wrong with this at all. It's just a little more verbose and takes a little longer to write. So if you don't need a constructor for any reason in your component, which in this case I don't think we're going to need it, you can just go ahead and use state as a what's called a class property, and it should work just the same. Alrighty, so thinking ahead here, the reason I added state was that we're going to need a way to keep track of what are the values that we currently have in our infinite input list. So if we think about that, as we're adding these, we need a way to dynamically update the UI and also keep track of what we're adding as a user. So, or actually as developers, but visually on screen, users are going to need a way to visually see what's coming back. So utilizing React State is a great way for us to do that. So what I'm going to do is start by mocking out what I think our state value is going to be here. So what I have in mind is just saying, we'll just say environment variables. I'm going to set this equal to an empty array. So by default, when this page loads up, it's just going to be an empty array. We're not going to have any environment variables in here. And then what I'm going to do is change this down here. So we've got our UI planned out, but right now this isn't dynamic. This is just using a static table row. And so what I want to do is convert this to say this.state. And look at that, our text editor is being a friend. We're going to say this.state environment variables.map. And as we iterate over that, we're going to spit out one of these table rows. And now, fortunately, this is a UI that I built not too long ago. Like I was saying in the introduction, that's what inspired this. So, did I say that in the introduction? I think I did. If I didn't, that's what inspired this. I was working with a mentorship customer at Clever Beagle, and they're building a hosting platform, and we needed to have an environment variables UI, and I was thinking, like, you know what, this would be an awesome feature Friday. So here we are. So with all of that in mind about what we did, one thing I'm going to do is specify an underscore ID value. So this is going to be a unique ID for our environment variable. And it's important to note that this unique ID is going to be generated by us, and we'll see how in a little bit. But for now, I'm just going to kind of jump ahead mentally and say, okay, I know that we're going to have an underscore ID value involved here, and I'm going to set it as the key prop or key attribute on each of the table rows that we're going to spit out here inside of our map function. And the reason I'm doing that is that's for React. So React requires any item or any element that's spit out inside of a loop to have a key, and that helps React keep track of those elements in the virtual DOM. So the virtual DOM is what React is using to render our interface on screen, and that's what makes it so fast. And when we're dealing with loops, because we're spitting out the same exact element over and over and over, React starts to have trouble keeping track of that. So by giving it a unique key, they can say in memory or in the virtual DOM, hey, this is the exact element that we're referring to right now, and then they can use that to kind of figure out how to put it on screen. So that's what's going on there. Now, the thing that we don't know is how we want to handle input into these two. And so I'm trying to think in my head, like, well, what do we want to do here? Why don't we do this? I'm gonna think ahead here, and we're gonna say, well, we know there's gonna be a key and a value, and so I'm gonna say the value. Now, not to be confused here, so value here is just referring to the value attribute that exists on any HTML input. And so what we're trying to say is we want the value of this input to reflect the key name that's currently set for this environment variable. So keep that in mind. That's a little bit tricky. So it's like one of those ones where they show you the color red and then they write blue on it. It's one of those. So you got to pay very close attention here. So it's key is just being set as the value of this input. And then down here, something a little more natural is the value of this input meaning the value of our environment variable, is actually going to be set to value. So be very careful while we're working through this. Don't get those two mixed up. Okay, so at this point, we have a rough kind of pattern of where we're headed and what we want to do. And now we need to make this interactive. So the thing that's missing right now is a way to add a new environment variable. So what I'm going to do is right beneath our table, and this probably isn't going to look the best, and we'll see as we go. We'll polish this all up. But I'm going to add a button, and I'll just say, again, that's BS style is Bootstrap style, and not the other BS. And we're going to add this button as a success style. So this makes it green with white text. And we're going to say add environment variable. If we can spell it right. There we go. And what we're going to do is actually rig up the ability to add a new variable. So right now we've got our state being mapped over. So because we're connected to that, technically speaking, if we start to update that state, we should see this rendered on screen. So just to keep us moving here and to see a little bit of magic early on, why don't we do that? So what I'm going to say is I'm going to say on click of this button, we're going to call to this. And again, we've converted this to a class-based component, so we can add functions or methods to this class and actually be able to access them. So I'm going to say this dot add environment variable, and then up here I'm going to say add environment variable equals. And keep in mind here, the reason I'm using an arrow function for this and not doing it with this kind of syntax is because what we want to do is make sure that we have access to the component instance, or the this value. And so if we define it without the arrow function, get myself all scrambled here. If we define it without the arrow function, what's going to happen is the value of this is only going to refer to that function by itself and not the entire index component that we're working in here, which is no bueno. We actually need it to let us access the entire component instance, because we got to get to this dot state as well as this dot set state. And we're going to see that in a few seconds here. So what we need to do when we're adding a new environment variable is we want to say get the existing environment variables first. So we're going to say take an array, and remember there's the golden rule in React of you never want to mutate state directly. So what we don't want to do is say something like this dot state dot environment variables equals something. That's a big no-no. We don't want to do that because that can trip up React. So what we're going to do is we're going to say create a new array, and then we're going to use the spread operator. So the spread operator, my favorite analogy for this is that assume that what we've got here is a suitcase, and that suitcase is filled with a bunch of shirts, and we're going to go to a hotel and we're going to stay overnight, and this array out here is the dresser drawer in the hotel room. And so what we need to do is unpack the contents of our suitcase, or spread the contents of our suitcase, so to speak, into the dresser drawers in the hotel room. So what the spread operator is doing, this dot 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 or ellipsis, what it's saying is unpack or spread out the contents of this value, this dot state dot environment variables, onto or into this array. And so because we're expecting this state environment variables to be an array itself, when we put a spread operator in front of it and wrap it in another array, basically what we're doing is we're creating a copy of that array. We're saying copy the elements or spread out the elements that currently exist in this state environment variables into this new array. And so what's neat about this is giving us a brand new copy of that array in memory. So we're no longer dealing with state directly. We're dealing with a copy of that state's current value. And so that means that we can modify this environment variables array to our heart's content and not really be in any trouble with React. It's not going to trip it up. So what I'm going to do here, because we're adding something new, now that we have a copy of the current value and we have a new array that we can mutate, I'm going to say environment variables dot push. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to push a new object into there, and I'm going to say we're going to have it an ID, a key, and a value. And keep in mind, down here, that's what we're expecting. So we expect an array of objects, and we expect it to have three properties: ID, key, and value. And so back up here, what we're going to do is fill those in. So when we're adding a new one, we know that it's not going to have a key and it's not going to have a value, but it does need an ID. And to help us out with this, what I'm going to do is import a package called random. So this is from the Meteor platform that Pup is built with. And the random package has a bunch of utility functions for generating random values. And one that it has, conveniently enough, is random.id. So when we call this function, this is going to return us I want to say it's 16 or 17 character hexadecimal string. So letters and numbers, kind of uppercase and lowercase all jumbled together. And that should be a unique ID value that we can use to reference this one environment variable on state. And we're going to see why that's important in just a little bit here. So what we're saying here is, okay, with our copy of our this state environment variable's value, so our brand new array, we want to push a new or a blank environment variable into that array. And we're doing this because we're creating a new one. So we're adding a new row to our table. And so what we're doing is in memory, we're modifying this array. So we're adding a new value to that array. And then with state, we got to remember that in order to make a change to it, we got to call to react this.setState. And conveniently, because the name of our variable right here is environment variables, we can use JavaScript shorthand to just say this set state environment variables. And what's going to happen is we're going to set this.state.environment variables to the contents of this variable with the same name. And so to demystify that a little bit, what we're effectively doing is this. We're saying that, but JavaScript, if we have a variable with the same name as the property that we're setting on an object, we can just pass the name directly, and JavaScript will interpret that as, oh, you want me to assign the property on this object to the contents of the variable with the same exact name. So we don't have to do a bunch of hoop jumping or having a bunch of duplicate text to get that result. So that's really nice. All right, so at this point, let me double check here. So we've got our button and we've got an on-click event. So we're saying add environment variable whenever we click that, and we expect it to inject or add a brand new environment variable, an empty one, to our value on state. So if we go ahead and save this, we're going to jump back over to our browser. And again, I don't expect this to look pretty just yet. We're going to work our way toward that. But right now, if we look, we've got an empty table, which is good. And then if we click this, beautiful. So we're already actually on our way. So we're getting an infinite input table here. So we're just able to add as many as we want. Now, if I click delete, obviously that's not working. So why don't we make that our next task? So what we're going to do is go back over here and we're going to find our delete button. And now this is probably one of my favorite parts. So this and updating the actual values in the inputs is super neat. But we're going to use a similar pattern for both the deletion and the updates, which may sound strange now, but once you see it, you're like, oh, that's really cool. So what we're going to do is we're going to say on click of delete, and this is the same exact thing we saw before mostly, except we're going to pass an empty function first, and then we're going to say this.handleDelete, and we'll spell the whole thing out so it's super clear, this.handleDelete environment variable. Now, the reason that I did that outer function is because we need to be able to pass a value when we call handleDelete environment variable. And what we need to pass is the underscore ID, the unique ID of that environment variable on state. And we have to do that because without it, we don't really know what we're trying to delete. We have no concept of that. And so when we do this syntax, what we're saying is, on click of this button, call this function, which by extension is going to end up calling this function. So it's basically one function calling another function for us. But what that affords us is it allows us to pass a value to the function that outer function is calling, and we still get away with only calling that function. So only calling that function being this.handleDelete environment variable, we only end up calling that when we actually click on the button. So if we dropped this at the front, technically this function would call immediately as soon as our UI renders, which is no bueno. We don't want that. So if we add this to the outside of it, that means that it's still only going to be called when that one button is clicked in the table. And by that one button, what we mean is that instance of the table row. So that environment variables button is being clicked. That's the only one that's actually going to fire that, which is great. So let's jump up and add handle delete environment variable as a method here. And like I said, this is my favorite because it's pretty neat. And again, we're going to use that arrow syntax. So we're going to say just like that. And remember, we're passing the ID of our environment variable. So what we're going to do to delete this, we're going to use some JavaScript fanciness. So again, I'm going to set up a value called environment variables. And I'm going to do the same exact thing. I'm going to say this.state environment variables. There it is. But now, instead of pushing or doing anything like that, all we're going to do is we're going to tack on the end of this, we're going to add a filter function. And this is a built-in JavaScript function that allows us to filter or eliminate items from an array in JavaScript. So what filter does is it says, I only want the things that pass a truthy test. Meaning, if we spell this out, what we're going to say is, I'll just call this variable for short, and we're going to say, I only want the values to stay in this array if their variable._ID value does not equal the ID that we've passed. And so if we look at that closely, what we're saying is, given our current copy of this.state environment variables, we only want to keep the variables in there with an ID that does not equal the ID that we're passing here, or the one that we're trying to delete. So the end result of that, which is super cool, is that we basically end up giving ourselves a brand new array as a result of this that omits or has effectively deleted the environment variable we're trying to get rid of. So we're not actually deleting it from the array, we're just omitting it from the array. But as far as our users are concerned, that's going to get the exact same result. So now we can just say, great, go ahead and set that result back onto state. And so just like we saw before down here, we're taking this part out and we're just saying take environment variables and add it back onto state. And again, we get that nice shorthand from JavaScript. So if we save this and then we pop back over to our browser, don't freak out, it is going to wipe our list out here. So remember, we start with nothing and we're not backing this data up in a database or in local storage or anything like that. So we expect it to go away. So I'm going to add a few here and then look at that. So we can just go ahead and, just to make sure this is clear, we'll say one. Oh, duh, we haven't wired this up yet. So I can't even type in these inputs. And the reason I can't is that if we go back over here and look, we've set a value attribute on these inputs, which in React basically says, hey, I'm going to control this input, or I'm making this a controlled input, which means that not only do we give the value, or excuse me, give the input its value, we also have to tell React how that value gets set in the first place via an onChange prop. So that's the last part of our tutorial here to get this whole thing wired up. But we haven't set that up yet, so I can't even type in here. So for now, you just got to kind of take it on faith that we're deleting the correct rows in our table here. So that's pretty neat. We're pretty far along here, but now we've got to actually make it so that we can type into these inputs. So what we're going to do is think a little bit ahead and actually write our function for updating first before we wire it up in the UI. And the reason I want to do that is I need to personally think through how are we going to make this reusable. So what I don't want to have to do is say handle update environment variable key, handle update environment variable value. That wouldn't be good. We should be able to reuse the same exact function no matter what. And so if we think about it, what we can do is say, and this is going to be rough, so you know, if you're watching this and you're one of those angry developers who has to pound your fist and scream like, why are you doing it that way? Chill. It's okay. Take a breath, maybe eat a cookie, you know, think about sunshine and birds and laughter, and you'll be okay. So what we're going to do is say ID. So again, we need a unique ID that we're trying to update. And then we need to know, well, which input are we trying to update? So I'm trying to think of how we can describe this. Why don't we say field, and then I'm going to pass value. So ID, we already know what that is. That's the unique ID of the environment variable we're trying to change in state. And field is going to be the field name. So it's either going to be key, meaning the key of the environment variable, or value, meaning the value of the environment variable. And then value here is referring to the actual value that's being typed into the input. So what I'm thinking here is we're going to say const environment variables again. Same exact pattern as the first function that we wrote. Actually, both of our functions that we've got already. And then what we're going to do is say const, const variable to update is equal to environment variables.find. And again, find is another built-in JavaScript function that helps us to find some value in an array. And we want to use this because we're dealing with objects. So we can't really get away with like an index of, or I think it contains or something like that. We can't get rid of, or can't get away with any of the traditional JavaScript array filter. See, I'm struggling to come up with words for what you call these things, but array functions. So we're going to use find because that allows us to iterate over objects or values in the array and then return the one we're looking for based on our truthy value. So what we're going to say, kind of like we saw down here with filter, but the inverse of it, we're going to say we want to get back the variable where the ID is equal to the ID that we've passed. And so what we expect this to do is actually give us back that object as it exists in the array. So if we look down here when we add a new one, this object, this exact object, we're trying to find the one that matches the ID that we passed here. So this should return us an object with an ID, a key, and a value on it, which is pretty neat. So if we jump back here, what we're going to say is variable to update. Now remember, we're trying to reuse handle update environment variable for both our key and our value inputs. And so remember, a few minutes ago I mentioned this field value. So what we're going to say is field goes here, and then we're going to set this equal to value. And so what we're effectively doing here is we're saying value to update dot. So this will be evaluated as something like, let's see, variable to update dot. And then if the field was the key, we're saying key equals whatever value is being typed in. Or if the field was the value, we're saying update the value. So effectively, we're setting either the key or the value on our environment variable as it exists on state, which is pretty awesome. And we're doing it dynamically too. So we're reusing this function for both of those different inputs, but we're not having to create separate functions for each, which is super awesome because that means that our code is nice and clean, but we're also being economical. So we're not cluttering up our code base with a bunch of duplicates. Because remember, as developers, the golden rule, the grand sin, is to not repeat yourself or dry. So don't repeat yourself. Never repeat yourself if you can avoid it. Sometimes you can't, but in a lot of cases you can. And so here we're going to say environment variable shorthand again. And now we've got our function ready to go for updating our inputs. So what I'm going to do is copy this, and then we're going to jump back down here. And like I was saying, because these are going to be controlled inputs, we need to add onChange handlers. So we're going to say onChange, and again I'm going to use that arrow because we don't want to just call this on render. We only want to call it when this input is actually being changed, or in this case when the user is actually typing in the input. So we're going to say this dot, I got to paste there. There we go, handle update environment variable. And what we want to do is say underscore ID, and in this case we're dealing with the key. And then here I'm going to type event.target.value, and event is going to come from here. So because this outer function is technically the thing that's being passed to the onChange handler, what we're going to get is the onChange event instance to that function. So we can take it and pass it from that outer function to here. We're technically not even passing it. We're just grabbing the value off of that event's target which in this case is going to be our env key input, and more specifically the exact env key that we're currently trying to change in the table. So what I'm going to do, because we're basically doing exactly the same thing, is I'm going to copy this and I'm going to add it to our value. But instead of key, we're going to make this value. So now if we save this, we should be pretty close to rock and roll with this UI. So I'm going to add one. I'm going to say tacos. Look at that. We're updating it. This is updating. And then I'm going to add two more. Crazy people typing in caps. And I'm going to say, oh, let's delete that one. And I'm going to delete that one. And we'll say tester. And we have infinite input table. Hot dog. Look at that. Pretty neat. So at this point, I'm actually pretty happy with this. There's a few things I'm noticing. So if we delete all of our variables, there's nothing that's really helping our users here. And then I'm also noticing this delete button. It's not taking up all the space, and that's gonna put me in an insane asylum. So let's go back over here real quick. And that button one is pretty easy. We can add a prop called block to the button, and that says take up the block width or the full width of its parent. So that should force it to fill the width. And pay attention, I'm doing this on the delete button. So on each of the rows that should fill the width. Deep breaths. Doesn't that look gorgeous? Nice and big and clickable, so we can't miss it. And if anybody sends us an email saying, how do I delete environment variables? We can just find out where they live and burn their house down. I'm kidding. Do not do that. Do never. No, I did not just tell you to commit arson. You're a crazy person. You're the one typing in all caps on a website. You're listening to a guy who's, speaking for a company with a cartoon dog for logo. You're the crazy one, not me. So we've got that working. That looks good. And then what was the other thing I just said? What does it look like for a blank state? So we don't have anything. So why don't we do this? So when I get into these situations, what I'll do is I'll just say wrap whatever I'm rendering with a call to say this.state, not necessarily this state environment variables, but I'll say this.state.thing.length is greater than 0. So if it's greater than 0, I want to render the thing. So in this case, I want to render the table of environment variables if there are actually environment variables to show. Otherwise, or else, and here we're using a ternary operator. So a ternary operator is the question mark followed by some content, and then the colon followed by some content. So another way to think about this is it's a condensed if-else statement. So if this is true, question mark, do this, so render this markup, otherwise or else render this markup. And this other markup is going to be an alert. So we're going to say, this alert again, this is coming from React Bootstrap. So I'm going to say this is a warning. We'll say, no environment variables yet. And because our big green button that says add environment variables is right below that, I'm not really going to explain in that text. There's no real need to do that. And we're getting an error, and that's because I didn't import up here the alert. And let's see here. So if we jump back over and give it a hard refresh, looks like we're going to be in business. So there we go. So we've got no environment variables yet. And if we click, we're getting them. We can delete them. Invar testing 1, 2, 3. Check that out. We delete all of them. And there we have it. So that is how to build an infinite input in React. I hope you enjoyed it. I had fun. That's one of my favorite pieces of UI to build. It really is. Obviously, this is one way to apply this idea. If you're dealing with anything like, I don't know, if you're building a to-do list or just any sort of multi-field input, this is a heck of a trick to know how to do. So definitely, practice this. I'm including the link to just the repo that I'm using as we're working here. So again, this isn't anything fancy. It's not the cleanest code in the world, but I'm going to upload this to GitHub. So this link will be down below in the description if you want to clone this and just kind of poke around and see what I'm up to, and maybe copy and paste it into your own project to see how it works. So that's going to do it for me, and that's going to do it for this Feature Friday. So thank you for watching. I really appreciate it, and we hope to see you back next week for another Feature Friday. Take care. If you enjoyed this tutorial, I'd really appreciate it if you head over to cleverbeagle.com/subscribe and sign up to get our latest tutorials and advice in your inbox as soon as they're published.